By the time Catherine Larson reached the covered steps of Almack's, sleet had soaked through the torn seam of her left kid slipper and turned her toes to stone. The leather flapped each time she took a stride, then sealed against her skin again with a wet, sucking drag that made her limp almost imperceptible, almost deniable. She held Lady Norwood's velvet cloak over one arm and the lady's ivory card case in both bare hands. Because gloves, Lady Norwood had said, were wasted on girls who carried rather than arrived. Coaches pressed in from both sides of King Street, wheels carving black slush through lantern light, and each passing team flung up fans of muddy water that struck Catherine's skirt hem and spread cold against her calves. Men in greatcoats vaulted down from carriages. Ladies rustled upward beneath fur and satin, their slippers never touching pooled water. No one looked twice at the young woman waiting half a pace behind Lady Norwood's footman. One woman looked once, then looked through her, the way one looked at a post. She kept her shoulders level because Lady Norwood despised visible discomfort. She kept her chin lifted because her father had once corrected her posture at his writing desk, with 2 fingers under her jaw and a smile in his voice. She kept swallowing because hunger came in waves now, dull first, then sharp, then hollow, and tonight the hollowness had climbed into her throat. The smell of warm beeswax and wine drifted from the vestibule every time the doors opened. It struck her like memory. She had not eaten since noon, and noon had been dry bread crusts in the scullery after Lady Norwood's daughters had taken the eggs and left the shells in the bowl. Her fingers were red to the knuckles from cold. A split at the side of her right thumb had opened again while she gripped the card case. She shifted it once, discreetly, and felt fresh sting as sleet found the cut. Lady Norwood stepped from the carriage as though weather obeyed her. Silver silk, pearl drops at her ears. Rose water heavy enough to drown the smell of wet horse and street smoke. She did not hurry. She never hurried. A circle of matrons formed, as if summoned by the rustle of her skirts, and she gave them a laugh that never reached her eyes before turning her head just enough to indicate Catherine without granting her full sight. "Our plain relation has become useful at last," she said, hands steadier than her face, which is fortunate. The matrons gave small sounds that passed for amusement. Catherine felt heat rise under skin already numb. She had learned years ago that replies cost more than silence, and silence still cost. She dipped her head. Lady Norwood took back the card case, left the cloak draped over Catherine's arm, and added in a tone of practical correction, "Service door, you will wait there until called. Do not come in unasked." She moved toward the entrance, then paused as a tray of petties, fours, floated by on a servant's shoulder. Catherine's gaze betrayed her for half a heartbeat. Lady Norwood followed it and smiled with careful contempt. "No supper for you. Thin girls require discipline, not cake." Then she entered the assembly rooms on a gust of warmth and music and candle wax, and the doors closed. Catherine crossed to the side passage where deliveries came and where the heat from the kitchens leaked only in thin breaths when the door swung open. The stone underfoot sweated with old damp. A lamp burned low in an iron bracket and left more shadow than light. She set the velvet cloak across a storage chest, folded it once, then stood with her back to the wall, because if she paced, the soaked slipper would split further, and she had no second pair. Music reached her in softened measures through plaster and distance. A waltz blurred to pulse, then laughter, then a tide of applause. From where she stood she could see only a corner of the alley, slick cobbles, stacked crates, the steam lifting from horse flanks when a carriage halted. 2 kitchen boys passed carrying bins of coal. One nodded to her with quick pity and did not speak. The other pretended not to see her at all, Pity could be reported. Not seeing was safer. Cold settled in layers. First the skin, then the joints, then the small muscles at the base of her neck that began to shake no matter how still she held herself. She pressed her wrists together to steady the tremor. On the inside of her left wrist, a faint line of yellowed bruising showed where Lady Norwood had gripped her 2 mornings ago for dropping a silver spoon that had already bent at the handle. Catherine tugged her sleeve down. She had become practiced at managing evidence. A bruise could be hidden by lace, a tear in a hem by a darker thread, hunger by swallowing water slowly and speaking less. The inventory of how she had arrived here was not memory arranged in polite sequence. It lived in her body as immediate fact. Her father's voice absent from every room. The key to his office removed from her chain the week after his burial. Her father remarried within the year, then died of winter fever before spring. Deeds transferred by signatures Catherine had not been allowed to witness. Accounts that bled from black to red while Lady Norwood acquired new silks, 2 grey mares, and a gaming habit discussed in whispers she was never meant to hear. Her bed moved from the west chamber to a narrow room under the eaves, because guests required better light. Her books packed away for dust, then redistributed to decorate drawing rooms, where she could dust them, but not open them. Even her surname altered by tone. Miss Larson, when blame required a proper noun. That girl when labour did not. She pressed one palm against her stomach until the cramp passed. If she bent forward, she might not straighten quickly enough when summoned. She had watched too many women in service dismissed for slowness, mistaken as insolence. A gust drove sleet through the alley mouth and stippled her skirt with fresh wet. She turned slightly, sheltering the folded cloak with her own body by reflex. Lady Norwood had once docked a maid's wages, because rain had touched a satin hem while the lady paused to greet a baronet's wife. The maid had wept in the pantry, quiet as breathing, then returned to work with swollen eyes, and no complaint. Catherine remembered that restraint more vividly than she remembered any ball. What Lady Norwood called carelessness, Catherine had begun to read as pattern. Missing sums in quarterly rents, repairs billed twice, a tenant widow turned out despite receipts marked paid, small amounts first, then larger, then brazen transfers that passed through 3 accounts and vanished into gaming notes signed with Lady Norwood's initials disguised by flourish. Catherine had found the first irregularity by accident in the steward's daybook when sent to carry tea. She had found the second by choosing not to forget the first. The ability to hold figures in her head, to see what matched and what did not, had come from years beside her father's desk when she was too young to be useful and old enough to be quiet. He had taught her columns before embroidery, interest before quadrille steps. Lady Norwood called that education unladylike. Catherine called it an air. She shifted her weight and felt the stitched packet against her petticoat seam, flat and constant at her left hip. Thin pages, copies in her own hand, dates, amounts, witness names where she could find them, blanks where she could not. She had pricked her fingers sewing the opening closed each night, then resealed it each morning before dawn, because trunks could be searched and mattresses lifted, but no one looked for legal proof in a hemline worn by a girl considered decorative only in absence. The thread scratched her skin now when she moved. The scratch steadied her. A footman cracked open the service door, let out a spill of heat and voices, and jerked his chin toward her. "Lady Norwood requires the blue fan. You are slow." Catherine nodded once. She did not answer that she had been exactly where ordered. She took the velvet cloak, shook off a drift of sleet, and followed him through corridors bright with gaslight, where polished floors reflected chandeliers in broken stars. She remained behind the last rank of mirrors, while Lady Norwood, laughing among women in pale silk and men in dark coats, extended one gloved hand without turning. "Fan!" Catherine placed it there. Lady Norwood accepted it and spoke to the woman beside her, as if continuing a thought unbroken by servants. "One cannot be sentimental. Charity breeds expectation." Her daughter, Miss Honoria Norwood, glanced back long enough to let her gaze travel from Catherine's wet hem to her bare hands, then smiled with inherited precision. "She appears chilled," Honoria said. "Perhaps she may stand nearer the kitchens, where the noise is less offensive." Lady Norwood gave a soft laugh. "She will stand wherever she is useful." The women turned away. Conversation flowed around Catherine and over her, discussing invitations, lace, officers, weather in Bath, the quality of this season's champagne. A violin climbed. Candlelight struck crystal and multiplied it. Somewhere beyond the crush, dancers formed and reformed in ordered circles. Catherine felt the ache in her feet with each beat of the music, though she did not move. She stood near a pillar with a tray of empty glasses in her hands because someone had pressed it into them and no one had returned to claim it. Men reached past her for fresh cups from passing servers and never met her eyes. Twice she was brushed hard enough to rock her balance. Twice she steadied the tray before a single glass tipped. Midnight drew close by the long clock in the corridor, each quarter hour marked by a muted strike that shivered through the floorboards under her soles. With every strike, the room grew warmer and louder, while her wet slipper remained cold as river stone. Hunger sharpened her hearing. She caught fragments she was not meant to catch, a name she recognised from debt notices, a joke about widows and settlements, Lady Norwood saying very low, "By dawn it shall be settled." Catherine lifted her head before she could stop herself. Lady Norwood met her eyes across the room for one precise second, and in that second Catherine understood she had been noticing. The lady's smile did not alter, but she tapped her fan once against her wrist, a signal used for dogs and dependents alike. Catherine set the tray down on the nearest sideboard and walked toward her. Her knees threatened to fail from cold when she moved too quickly after standing still, but she kept her pace even. She stopped at the proper distance. Lady Norwood tilted her head as if to admire a dance figure, then spoke without looking at her. "You will wait by the rear doors again. Do not disappear, Miss Larson. Tonight you may finally prove your value." Catherine inclined her head as if receiving an honour, turned on the heel of her ruined slipper, and crossed the edge of the ballroom where heat clung to velvet draperies and candle smoke floated in pale veils beneath the chandeliers. She passed between two footmen carrying silver salvers and out through the narrower passage that led to the rear doors, where warmth thinned, light failed, and the stone breathed cold through her soles. The corridor smelled of damp wool, coal dust, and spilled claret. Somewhere close, a scullion laughed and was hushed at once. She stopped where the corridor widened into a service antechamber, set Lady Norwood's cloak over her forearms again, and fixed her gaze on the seam of the opposite wall so that no one could claim she stared. "Prove your value." Lady Norwood had used those words first the week after the funeral, when black crepes still hung from the stair rail, and the house still carried the medicinal smell of fever herbs in every room. Catherine had been 20 then, not 21. Her father had been gone 3 days. Lady Norwood had stood in the breakfast parlour in lilac silk, not morning black, and had placed the household keys on the table one by one as if counting coins. "Your father trusted me with order," she had said. "I will now trust you with usefulness." Then she had sent Catherine upstairs to strip her own chamber of personal things before guests arrived to offer condolences and inspect the widow's composure. By nightfall, the west chamber with the south windows was no longer hers. Her mother's walnut dressing table had been moved to Lady Norwood's room. The small writing stand her father had given her on her 17th birthday was carried to the schoolroom for the younger Miss Norwood to practice French verbs and then, by winter, disappeared entirely. Her books had gone next. History first, then poetry, then her father's ledgers, tied in bundles by a maid too frightened to meet Catherine's eye. "Dust breeds in neglected pages," Lady Norwood had said, when Catherine asked softly where they were being taken. "And neglected girls breed self-importance." That same week, Honoria had taken Catherine's blue merino walking dress because the colour suited her complexion better, while her sister claimed Catherine's winter mantle and complained the sleeves were provincial. Catherine had stood in the doorway with chilled hands clasped behind her back, hearing two girls discuss which of her possessions could be altered without ruining the fabric, as if she were absent, as if she had already become furniture. She had not protested. Her father had taught her numbers. He had not taught her how to fight in rooms where rank and cruelty spoke the same language. Her father's death had not been the beginning of the taking. The beginning had been his second marriage, celebrated under summer roses, while Catherine still wore half mourning for the mother she had buried at 15. Lady Norwood had arrived with polished manners, a widow's soft voice, and daughters educated to mirror her expressions a breath after she made them. At first there had been corrections, always couched as affection. Catherine held her fork too low. Catherine's laugh was too quick. Catherine spent too much time in the office where men discussed rents and contracts. "A young lady does not smell of ink," Lady Norwood had murmured, smiling while removing the key to the office from Catherine's chain and fastening it to her own chatelaine. Then came exclusions that looked like etiquette to anyone who wished to misunderstand. Catherine was not introduced at one dinner because her mourning was still recent. She was not invited to one musicale because her head ached, according to a message she had never sent. She was not listed on one calling card because space was limited. Small omissions, repeated, effective. By the next season, acquaintances who had known her since childhood called her Miss Larson with uncertainty, then forgot the surname entirely. Lady Norwood encouraged it with gentle amusement. "Our plain relation is shy," she would explain, while Catherine stood 2 paces behind, with shawls over her arm. Plain became a verdict that absolved everyone of curiosity. Plain meant no one asked why Catherine's gloves had split at the fingers in December. Plain meant no one noticed that she ate standing beside the kitchen range after midnight, if there was anything left to eat. Plain meant she could pass through her own drawing room carrying coal and hear her father's friends discuss the decline of Larson management as if no heir remained alive. Yet the facts that mattered had remained sharp in her mind, each one a nail she could not pull free. Her father had signed a marriage settlement that protected her dowry until she reached 25, or married by her own consent. He had also, against his solicitor's advice, given Lady Norwood discretionary authority over household expenditures during his illnesses. He had believed his charm with risk would outpace the losses at cards that began after supper and ended at dawn. When winter fever took him, authority and debt were braided tightly enough that grief could not be separated from arithmetic. Lady Norwood wore black for the required months, then silver, then rose, while creditors resumed their calls at the side entrance, and Catherine learned the cadence of men who spoke politely about ruin. Now, in the rear antechamber, the same arithmetic pressed against Catherine's skin with the weight of the stitched papers at her hip. Her hunger had become a clean pain, no longer jagged, simply there. A maid carrying empty tureens paused near her and shifted one to the other arm. It was Martha from the Norwood House kitchens, sent tonight with the temporary staff. Martha's cap sat crooked from haste, and a flour mark crossed one cheek. She looked at Catherine's hands, then at the cloak, then at the closed service door behind which steam and broth scented the air. "Miss," she whispered, barely moving her lips, "there is heel broth in the pan room if you can come round in 10 minutes. Catherine shook her head once. If she vanished and was called, Lady Norwood would punish Martha first and Catherine second. Martha understood immediately. She gave the smallest nod, the nod of women who survived by seeing and saying little, and went on. From the ballroom side, music swelled again, a waltz in triple time, and the vibration came through the wall as a steady thrum under Catherine's shoulder blades. She thought of the first debt notice delivered after the mourning year, folded thick and sealed in red wax. She had opened it because Lady Norwood was out visiting, and no one else dared. The amount had made no sense against the rents she remembered. She had gone to the steward's room, asked for the quarter books, and been refused by a man who had known her since infancy, his eyes apologetic, his mouth firm. That night she had waited until the household slept, gone barefoot to the office, and found the duplicate daybook in a locked drawer whose key Lady Norwood kept on the same ring as the cellar and linen keys. Catherine had copied by candlelight for 3 hours, columns first, then notations in the margin where sums had been altered after entry. She had hidden the copies inside her mattress, ticking until Lady Norwood ordered the mattresses beaten in the yard, then moved them to a false hem in an old petticoat no one would steal. From that night onward, she had kept 2 lives. In one she carried cloaks, poured tea, accepted correction, and lowered her eyes when called plain. In the other she counted. She tracked every transfer from Larson Rents to accounts opened in Lady Norwood's maiden name. She noted every jeweller's invoice paid from maintenance funds meant for tenant roofs. She recorded the date on which 2 cottages were turned out despite marked receipts, because the receipts had been entered as unpaid in the new ledger, and the difference had vanished into a London gaming club account 3 weeks later. She learned which clerk drank, which one kept carbon copies in his desk, which one pitied her enough to leave a register unlocked for 12 minutes while he fetched sealing wax. Numbers did not pity. Numbers did not flatter. They either aligned or they betrayed. In a house where speech was twisted daily, figures were the only language that held. The cruelest theft had not been coin. It had been witness. Lady Norwood had arranged her daughters' birthdays as tableau of abundance, while the servants waited 6 months for wages, and Catherine mended her chemises by candle stubs. She had laughed at supper that Catherine had no appetite for sweets, then ordered the tray removed before Catherine sat. She had instructed modistes to fit gowns for Honoria and her sister from fabrics bought in Catherine's father's name, and when Catherine asked whether she might have one serviceable dress for winter calls, Lady Norwood had touched her cheek with cool fingers and said, almost kindly, "One does not spend silk on obscurity." The daughters repeated everything. They perfected the maternal tilt of the head, the soft insult disguised as concern, the habit of discussing Catherine in the third person while she pinned their hems. Once, when a visiting aunt asked why Miss Larson was never seen in company, Honoria had replied, "She is happier where she is least observed." Catherine had been standing behind her chair with the tea kettle, wrist aching from its weight, and had felt a strange, dry clarity settle where shame used to live. They needed her unseen. They needed her ignorant. They needed her to remain the vessel into which blame could be poured when accounts tightened and gossip thickened. By the second week of January, she had started marking dates in tiny script along the inner waistband of her petticoat because paper could be found and burned. By February, she had copied enough to prove a pattern, not an error. By March, she had understood that proof alone would not save her. Proof required a room full of witnesses, and a moment Lady Norwood could not control. Tonight might be that moment, or it might be another lesson in endurance. The command to prove value still rang in her ears as the ballroom door opened and shut, bleeding light each time across the flagstones at her feet. Catherine adjusted the cloak on her arms, straightened despite the cramp in her back, and waited in the corridor where the house had tried to erase her, carrying in her hem the account of everything it had done. The ballroom door opened once more, and this time Lady Norwood herself crossed the threshold into the service antechamber, silver silk bright even in the weak light, rose water cutting through coal and damp stone like a blade through cloth. She was not alone. A man followed half a pace behind her, thick through the shoulders, older by 20 years than Catherine, his smile damp at the corners and his eyes fixed with the proprietary calm of someone examining a purchase. He wore a plum coat stretched over his middle, a ring with a seal too large for taste, and on his cuff Catherine saw a smear of sealing wax, the colour of old blood. In his gloved hand he carried a folded paper already opened once, then refolded. Lady Norwood did not offer introduction. She extended her fan toward Catherine as one points at a ledger entry requiring correction. "Stand straight," she said. "Mr. Halbert has been patient, and patience must be rewarded." Catherine felt the cold from her soaked slipper climb all the way to her knee. Her fingers tightened under the weight of the cloak. "I do not understand, ma'am." Lady Norwood's mouth curved with weary indulgence. "You understand arithmetic. Do not insult me by pretending ignorance now." She took the paper from Mr. Halbert, shook it once, and held it where Catherine could see the notary's hand at the bottom. Not a marriage contract yet. A draft declaration of intent, names blank in 2 places, settlement terms filled, Catherine's name already written in the margin, as if someone had been practising possession. "By dawn," Lady Norwood said softly, "either this is signed or I release your little copies to the wrong hands, and tell the magistrate you forged every figure to extort me. A dutiful daughter settles family obligations. A stubborn one ruins herself and every servant who has assisted her." Mr. Halbert gave a sound that might have been a laugh had it possessed warmth. "I'm not unkind, Miss Larson. I ask only obedience." Catherine looked from the paper to Lady Norwood, then to the service door where broth steam leaked under the frame and vanished in the cold. She thought of Martha's flour-marked cheek, of unpaid wages, of tenant roofs caving under spring rain while gaming accounts fattened. "My consent is required," she said, and her voice came out steadier than the rest of her. Lady Norwood stepped in close enough for Catherine to feel the stiff embroidery of the lady's bodice against her own wet sleeve. Her fingers closed around the yellowing bruise at Catherine's wrist and pressed with expert precision. "Your consent," she said, "is a decorative formality." The quarter hour struck then, muted but clear through the walls. By the final quarter before midnight, every dance floor in the room was full and every witness in place. Lady Norwood released Catherine's wrist, turned, and spoke over her shoulder without lowering her voice. "Bring her." Catherine moved because the alternative was to be dragged, and because dragged women were dismissed as hysterical, while obedient women were still listened to for a few seconds longer. She crossed back into heat and candlelight, with sleet drying stiff along her hem, the torn slipper whispering against polished floorboards, her stomach hollow and clenched. The musicians were changing sets, footmen threaded between clusters of guests with champagne. Laughter rose, then broke, then rose again. Lady Norwood guided Catherine not to the edge but to the centre lane where dancers assembled for the next waltz. Heads turned in a slow chain, curiosity passing from face to face. Honoria Norwood, near the mirrored wall in pale blue satin, lifted her brows as if at unexpected entertainment. Lady Norwood raised her fan for silence she had not earned, but always received. "My friends," she called, bright and carrying. "A small domestic matter before the next turn. Miss Larson has reached that useful age when gratitude may be demonstrated. She will accept an honourable offer this evening, and show us she can obey with grace. The next waltz shall serve as her audition." A few women smiled behind their fans. A man near the card-room doors snorted into his glass. "Mr." Halberd took one step forward and extended his hand toward Catherine with theatrical patience. "Miss Larson." Her pulse struck hard at her throat. The room had narrowed to his ringed fingers and the empty space around them. If she refused openly now, Lady Norwood would call it madness, ingratitude, theft. If she accepted, she entered a cage that would close before dawn. The folded packets stitched into her petticoat seemed suddenly to burn against her skin, proof and danger in the same seam. She heard, from very far away, Martha drop something metal in the corridor beyond the service doors. The clang rang once. No one in the ballroom flinched. Lady Norwood's eyes held hers, cool, expectant, triumphant. "Take his hand," she said. Another hand entered the space first. It came from Catherine's left, gloved in black, steady, unapologetic, and it did not ask permission from Lady Norwood, Mr. Halberd, or anyone watching. The man attached to it stepped fully into the candlelight with the economy of someone used to crossing battle lines and drawing them at the same time. He was tall enough that the chandeliers threw sharp planes across his face, dark-haired, broad-shouldered under a coat cut in severe black, his cravat tied without ornament. A narrow scar marked the line of his jaw from ear to chin, pale against winter skin. His eyes were grey, not soft grey, but the grey of river water under storm. The room recognised him in a single breath and shifted to make space. Conversations broke off mid-syllable. Even the musicians, seeing the movement from the dais, hesitated with bows half lifted. Catherine had seen him only at a distance in Hyde Park, and once from the upper landing, at a musicale where Lady Norwood had named him, in a whisper sharpened by resentment, Viscount Adrian Vale. War hero, widower by rumour, though not by confirmed fact, landholder with a reputation for exact accounts and a temper that did not flare so much as freeze. Men said he had petitioned Parliament against a procurement fraud ring and bankrupted 3 titled families in one session by producing ledgers no one knew he possessed. Women said he never danced. He looked at Catherine now as if the rest of the room was scenery. "Miss Larson," he said. His voice was low, clipped, unadorned. "You will waltz with me." Mr. Halberd made a protesting noise and recovered into a smile. "My Lord Vale, I believe the young lady is engaged." Adrian Vale did not look at him. "She is not." Lady Norwood's fan snapped shut. "My lord, this is a family arrangement." He turned his head then, slowly enough that the movement itself became a warning. "Then arrange it elsewhere." Silence widened. Catherine could feel every pair of eyes on her wet hem, her bare hands, her split thumb, the faint swelling where Lady Norwood had struck her 2 days prior. Her shame burned, then sharpened, then settled into something harder. Viscount Vale still held out his hand, not gentle, not pleading, an order offered as a bridge. She placed her hand in his. The first steps of the waltz began around them like machinery restarting. Couples moved into turn. Vale's palm settled at the proper distance on her back, formal enough for scrutiny, firm enough that no one could cut in without force. He guided her into motion. Catherine's left slipper slipped once on the polished wood where meltwater had dampened the sole. He adjusted at once, changing the angle of the turn so her ruined shoe took shorter glides. "You are limping," he said, eyes fixed beyond her shoulder as etiquette required. "Yes, my lord." "Do not lie to spare me discomfort." "Then yes, my lord." The seam split in sleet. They passed Lady Norwood on the outer circle. The lady's smile had calcified. Mr. Halbert stood rigid near the card-room arch, glass unlifted in his hand. The Viscount's gaze dropped briefly to Catherine's wrist, where her sleeve had ridden back in the turn. "Bruising! Finger marks!" Catherine tugged the cuff down. "I am clumsy." "Liar!" The word landed quiet and exact. Heat rushed to her face, not from embarrassment alone, but from the shock of being named accurately in a room built on pretense. They turned again. His coat carried cold air and faint leather, as if he had come in directly from the street and had not stopped to warm himself. "You are shaking," he said. "From cold." "From hunger," she swallowed. "Both." He did not offer pity. He altered their path once more, keeping them away from clusters where Lady Norwood's allies stood closest, as if he had mapped allegiances before stepping onto the floor. "Who is Halberd?" he asked. "A creditor." "To whom?" She met his eyes for one breath. "To Lady Norwood's accounts." "And she offers you as settlement." It was not a question. The turn carried them past the musicians. A violinist stared, then dropped his gaze quickly to strings. Catherine heard herself answer in the same formal cadence, because anything less would crack. "She calls it gratitude." His jaw tightened, scar pulling faintly along one side. "She calls many things by false names." By the middle of the set, sweat gathered beneath Catherine's damp bodice despite the cold in her feet. Hunger and motion made the room tilt at the edges. Vale noticed the shift at once. His grip on her back changed by half an inch, enough to anchor without appearing to hold. "Breathe," he said. She obeyed because command was easier than collapse. Around them the dance continued with outward normalcy, but she saw the watchers now. 2 matrons tracking each turn with bright predatory focus, a cluster of young men pretending conversation while listening to every word they could catch. Honoria whispering behind her fan to her sister, with eyes narrowed in calculation. Lady Norwood had not moved from her station near the mirrored wall. She watched Catherine as one watches a servant carrying porcelain over stone stairs, waiting for the drop. "Why?" Catherine asked before caution could stop her. "Why intervene?" Vale's eyes returned to hers, expression unreadable. "Because you were being bartered in public and no one objected." The answer struck deeper than courtesy could reach. They turned through another measure. "You know nothing of my family," she said. "I know enough. Your dress is wet to the knee. Your hands are bare. Your sleeve hides old and new marks. You were ordered to smile at a man you fear." His voice remained even, almost cold, but each observation felt like someone lifting stones from her chest and laying them in plain view where others could no longer pretend not to see. "That is not family. That is transaction." Lady Norwood stepped one pace forward as they passed, fan lifted like a signal flag. "Miss Larson," she called sweetly, "do not forget your obligation." Catherine kept moving. Vale answered without turning his head. "She has not forgotten. I have." A flicker crossed Lady Norwood's face, too swift for most to read. Fear quickly hidden. The Viscount's attention shifted toward the far doors where a uniformed porter had appeared, speaking quietly to one of Almac's stewards. Catherine followed the glance and caught only the glint of a magistrate's chain under a greatcoat before the man stepped back into shadow. Her heart struck harder. Had Vale summoned him already, or had he simply expected a night like this and come prepared? The dance carried her away before she could look again. "My lord," she said, keeping her voice low, "if you make an enemy of Lady Norwood, she will claim scandal and ruin me with it. She has already attempted both. You do not understand how thoroughly she controls the narrative." A pause. "Then we will alter the audience." The final refrain approached. Couples began to widen the circle for the closing turn. Catherine's calf cramped from compensating for the broken slipper, and a tremor ran through her thigh. Vale felt it and slowed the rotation by an almost imperceptible degree, taking the strain without announcing rescue. "When this set ends," he said, "you will not leave my sight." "You cannot command me, my lord." For the first time his mouth moved, the smallest shift, not warmth and not mockery, merely acknowledgement. "No, I can only command the room." They completed the last turn and came to stillness as the music resolved in a clean, bright chord. Applause scattered, uncertain and thin. Vale released her hand with formal precision and bowed exactly as etiquette required. When he straightened, his gaze moved past her shoulder to Lady Norwood and then to Mr. Halberd, and his voice carried just far enough for those nearest to hear and repeat. "Do not present her again as debt." Catherine felt the words land across the ballroom like a seal pressed into hot wax. Lady Norwood's fan trembled once, then stilled. Mr. Halberd looked toward the card-room, as if calculating exits. The porter at the far door shifted his weight and waited for instruction that had not yet been spoken. Catherine stood in the centre of the floor with cold in her bones, hunger in her throat, proof stitched into her hem, and the Viscount beside her like winter held upright. Lady Norwood began to move toward them at once, smile fixed, fan open, silver skirts whispering over the boards like a warning drawn from silk. Mr. Halberd followed 2 paces behind, no longer smiling, his broad face gone flat with calculation. Catherine felt the pressure of the room close in again, curiosity turning sharp now that the dance had ended, and no music hid the edges of speech. "Miss Larson," Lady Norwood said, her tone bright enough to cut glass, "you have had your little exhibition. Come here." Catherine did not move. Her feet ached inside wet leather. Her pulse still struck hard from the waltz. Beside her, Viscount Vale stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture effortless, gaze directed not at Lady Norwood, but at the nearest steward, as if deciding where to place furniture. "She remains where she chooses," he said. Lady Norwood's fan paused midway to her cheek. "My lord, family matters do not require your supervision." "Then cease conducting them in public." A few nearby guests made soft sounds and looked away with the hungry discipline of people pretending not to witness a duel. Honoria Norwood, by the mirrored wall, had gone still as carved alabaster. Mr. Halberd cleared his throat and shifted his weight, angling as though to step between Catherine and the Viscount. At that instant, from the side corridor near the refreshment room, came a hard crack of shattering crystal, then a sharp cry, then the clatter of a tray striking stone. Heads turned. No one moved. A footman took one step toward the sound and stopped when a steward caught his sleeve. "Not through the guests," the steward hissed. "Use the back." The cry came again, lower now, breath dragged through pain. Catherine knew the voice before she thought. Martha. She moved. Lady Norwood snapped, "Stop!" The command caught her shoulder, but not her feet. Catherine gathered her skirt and crossed the edge of the ballroom at speed, slipping once on spilled wine, then righting herself against a pillar with her palm. Behind her she heard Lady Norwood call her name in that precise, carrying voice reserved for punishment performed as etiquette. She kept going. The side corridor was narrower than the ballroom by half and colder by twice. Gaslight wavered in wall brackets. Broken crystal lay in a glittering arc across the flagstones, bright as ice. Martha was on one knee near the wall, a fallen champagne tray beside her, her cap skewed, face gone paper white. She pressed one hand into the other and rocked with short, tight breaths, trying not to make sound. A young scullion stood frozen 3 paces away, with a bucket in his hands. Catherine dropped beside Martha at once. "Let me see." Martha shook her head reflexively, still pressing hard. "No, miss. If Lady Norwood sees—" "She has already seen worse. Give me your hand." Martha obeyed because pain stripped argument. When she lifted her hand, a clean, deep slice crossed the heel of her palm, where a crystal stem had broken under weight. Blood ran quickly over her wrist and down her cuff, bright in the dim light. Catherine took Martha's wrist and pressed her thumb hard above the cut, steady and exact. "Look at me," Catherine said. "Breathe through your nose. Slow." Martha's eyes, wet and wild, found hers. "I dropped it. I did not mean—" "I know. Keep pressure here." Catherine looked for cloth. None. Her own apron was damp and dirty from alley sleet. Her gloves were non-existent. She reached under her overskirt, found the clean lining of her underskirt near the side seam, and pulled. The first tear did not run. She braced the fabric against her knee and tore again, harder, ripping a long strip with a sound like paper splitting. Cold air struck the skin of her calf through the gap. She folded the cloth twice, pressed it over the wound, then wrapped the strip tight around Martha's palm and wrist, knotting one-handed while maintaining pressure. "Hold it above your heart." Martha lifted her arm, shaking. From behind came the rustle of silk and the scent of rosewater. Lady Norwood had reached the corridor, accompanied by Honoria and 2 matrons who had followed to collect scandal like dropped pins. "What is this display?" Lady Norwood asked. "Get up, Catherine. The servants can mend themselves." Catherine did not look up. "She requires pressure and clean binding now, not later." "She requires discipline," Lady Norwood replied, "and you require obedience." Honoria gave a light, brittle laugh. "How touching! Our plain relation has discovered charity." Catherine tied the last knot and tucked the end beneath itself so it would not slip. Martha winced, then steadied. Blood had already slowed through the cloth. The scullion with the bucket remained motionless, eyes flicking between faces. Catherine held out her hand to him. "Your name?" "Tom, miss." "Tom, run to the pan room. Bring hot broth and a clean towel, not boiling. Warm, quickly." Tom looked to Lady Norwood first, as servants did when survival depended on reading power correctly. Lady Norwood said, "Stay where you are." Catherine reached into the hidden seam at her cuff and drew out the single coin she had kept for emergencies, a worn shilling warmed by her skin. She pressed it into Tom's palm and closed his fingers over it. "Go," she said. Tom went. Lady Norwood's expression tightened by a degree too small for most to notice. "Giving away money that does not belong to you is still theft, Miss Larson." "It was mine. Everything in this household is mine until I account otherwise." Catherine rose then, slowly because her left foot had gone numb again, and the corridor tilted at the edges when she stood too fast. She placed herself slightly in front of Martha without thinking, a narrow shield of wet wool and stubborn spine. "Then account for this as necessary expenditure," she said. One of the matrons drew in breath. Honoria's fan snapped open and shut once. Lady Norwood took a step closer, voice dropping so only those nearest could hear. "You forget yourself." "No, ma'am," Catherine said. "I remember perfectly." The words left her mouth before caution could recapture them. She felt the cost as soon as she heard them. Lady Norwood's face remained composed, but a pulse leaped once at her temple. "Return to the ballroom," Lady Norwood said. "Now you will apologise to Mr. Halberd and accept what is arranged." A shadow shifted at the corridor entrance. Viscount Vale had followed, though silently enough that Catherine had not heard his approach. He stood half in darkness, one shoulder against the stone jamb, hands still behind his back. He had the stillness of a man who missed nothing because he expected treachery from every corner. His gaze moved first to Martha's bandaged hand, then to the torn edge of Catherine's skirt lining, then to the empty place at Catherine's cuff where the coin had been. He spoke to Lady Norwood without raising his voice. "She is occupied." Lady Norwood turned with brittle grace. "My lord, are you now master of my servants as well?" "I am master of my patience," he said. "Do not test its limit." For one suspended moment, no one in the corridor breathed. Then Tom came running back with a mug of broth steaming in both hands and a folded towel under his arm. He stopped short when he saw the Viscount nearly spilling the broth. Catherine took the mug, tested the rim with her finger, and nodded. "Good. Give her the towel for under the arm. Keep the hand raised." She pressed the mug into Martha's uninjured hand. "Small sips, slowly. You lost little, but shock will make you shake." Martha drank, teeth clicking once against the rim. Colour began to return in faint patches along her cheeks. "Miss," Martha whispered, tears standing now from relief as much as pain, "I'm sorry. I should have been careful." "You were carrying too much on wet stone," Catherine said. "That is not carelessness. That is arithmetic." Lady Norwood laughed once, a soft, disbelieving sound. "You presume to lecture on household management while kneeling in a corridor." Catherine turned her head at last. "No, ma'am. I presume only to stop bleeding when I see it." Vale's eyes rested on her face. She could not read him. She could only feel with uncomfortable clarity that he had watched every movement and counted every choice, where she placed her hands, what she tore, what she gave away, whom she protected first. By midnight, the next dance had begun in the ballroom, and the distant music reached the corridor in muffled pulses that made the scene feel even more exposed, as if two worlds ran side by side and only one of them told the truth. Lady Norwood drew herself up, gathering authority around her like additional fabric. "Martha, you will report to the steward and explain how this breakage occurred. Miss Larson will attend me at once." Martha flinched. Catherine saw fear move through her before she answered. "It was my fault, my lady," Martha said quickly. "The tray slipped." Catherine spoke over her, calm and clear. "The floor was wet from guest traffic. The tray was overloaded. Assign blame to me if blame is required. I called her name and startled her." That was not true, but it redirected the line of harm exactly where Catherine intended. Martha looked at her with stricken gratitude. Lady Norwood's gaze sharpened. "How noble," she said. "You collect guilt now as well as rags." Honoria murmured to one matron, too softly for most ears, not too soft for Catherine's. "She does enjoy theatrics when men are watching." Catherine felt heat rise under her skin, then forced it down. She had no spare strength for rage. Her stomach had begun to knot again as adrenaline drained. The torn slipper bit at her heel each time she shifted weight. Vale pushed off the jam and stepped fully into the light. "Enough!" The single word landed like a door closing. Even Lady Norwood paused. He looked to Tom. "Take Martha to the housekeeper's room. Tell Mrs. Fenwick I ordered the hand checked and rewrapped in clean linen within the quarter hour." Tom nodded so hard his cap slipped. "Yes, my lord." Mrs. Fenwick was Almac's senior housekeeper. Mentioning her made this no longer private household punishment. It became institution, record, witness. Lady Norwood heard it and understood at once. "You overstep," she said. "I document," he replied. Tom helped Martha rise. Catherine moved to steady her elbow as they passed. Martha caught Catherine's sleeve with her free fingers and squeezed once, brief and fierce. Then she was gone down the back passage, Tom beside her, broth steaming in the cold air behind them. Silence returned, threaded with distant violins. Lady Norwood turned on Catherine with a smile so thin it looked painful. "You have embarrassed me in front of half London," Catherine answered before fear could close her throat. "No, ma'am. I prevented a servant from losing use of her hand. Do not pretend compassion. You seek attention." "If I sought attention, I would have remained in the centre of your floor." One matron lowered her fan to hide what might have been approval. Honoria's eyes flashed. Lady Norwood took a breath and smoothed her expression, rebuilding civility with visible effort. "Very well," she said. "If my plain relation wishes to play benefactress, she may do so after she satisfies her obligations. Mr. Halbert is waiting. You will come now." Catherine opened her mouth to refuse, but Vale spoke first. "She will take 10 minutes." Lady Norwood stared at him. "For what purpose?" "To wash her hands, to warm herself, to stand without swaying." "I do not require your diagnosis of my household." "You required my dance floor," he said. "You have had both." The faintest tremor touched Lady Norwood's fan again. She snapped it closed. 10 minutes, then, no more." She turned and swept back toward the ballroom with Honoria and the matrons in her wake, silk and whispers trailing behind her like smoke. Mr. Halbert lingered at the bend of the corridor long enough to give Catherine a look of proprietary annoyance, then followed. Catherine remained where she was until their footsteps faded. Only then did she feel how badly her hands shook. Blood, not hers, had dried in thin rust-coloured lines across her fingers and under one nail. Her torn skirt lining brushed her calf with each small movement, a cold reminder of what she had stripped away. Vale had not moved. "You gave your only coin," he said. It was not a question. She nodded once. "For broth," she answered, "and speed." "You tore your own garment for bandage." "Yes." "You accepted blame that was not yours." "Lady Norwood punishes downward first." His gaze held hers. "You calculate quickly." "My father taught me accounts." "That was not accounting." "It was." She lifted her chin despite the tremor in it. "Cost against consequence. If Martha loses use of her hand, she loses wages. If she loses wages, she loses lodging. A cut is cheaper than exile." For the first time since she had seen him, something altered in his face. Not softness, not ease. A minute release at the corner of his mouth that might have become a smile in another life and did not hear. "Come," he said, "wash." He did not offer an arm. He did not touch her. He simply turned toward the small retiring room off the passage where a basin stood for staff and minor spills, and he waited until she matched his pace. At the basin, the water was already pink from someone else's hurried rinse. Catherine poured fresh from a ewer, dipped her hands, and watched diluted red ribbon away down porcelain, the cold bit first, then numbed. She scrubbed at her fingers until the last trace lifted. Vale stood by the door, angled so anyone entering the corridor would see him before they saw her, guard by posture. protection by obstruction, command disguised as idle presence. She dried her hands on coarse linen and faced him. Up close, the scar along his jaw looked older than gossip suggested, pale and tight where skin had healed badly once, and then healed again. His eyes were unreadable in the dim light. "Why were you in that corridor before Lady Norwood arrived?" she asked quietly. "Because servants cry out where truth leaks first." The answer sat between them, stark and strange. She believed it. He reached into his coat and took out a folded square of clean linen, plain and white, likely from his own pocket reserve. He held it out. "For your cuff," he said. "You are bleeding." She looked down. The split at her right thumb had reopened during the bandaging. A narrow line of blood had marked her wrist. She had not felt it. "Thank you," she said, and wrapped the linen once around the cut. When she looked up again, his attention had shifted to the torn seam of her skirt where the lining had been ripped away. For a sick second she thought of the stitched packet at her hip and felt panic flash. But the packet lay higher, intact, hidden behind unbroken stitching. He had seen damage, not secret. "You cannot return to the floor dressed like that," he said. "I have no second gown." "Then you will return precisely as you are. That will invite comment." "It already has." From the ballroom came a swell of applause, then laughter, then the scrape of chairs as spectators shifted for better views of whatever scene might come next. Catherine felt the 10 minutes collapsing around her. "I should go," she said. "If I delay further, she will claim defiance." "You are defiant," she met his gaze, "only where it matters." "Good." The word was quiet. It carried more weight than praise. He opened the door and stood aside for her to pass. But as she reached the threshold, he spoke again, a voice low enough that only she could hear. "When they ask what happened in the corridor, tell the same story you told just now. Wet stone, overloaded tray. Your call. Do not vary one word." She turned back, startled. "Why?" "Because consistency survives scrutiny." The language was legal, tactical, mercilessly practical. It sounded like his world. It sounded like the only kind of care he trusted. Catherine nodded. "I understand." Together they stepped back toward the ballroom, where light blazed, music climbed, and Lady Norwood waited with Mr. Halberd near the centre lane, as if the intervening minutes had been an inconvenience to be erased. Catherine's torn hem whispered over polished boards. Her hands were clean. Her stomach was still empty. Her fear was still present. But Martha was walking, not collapsing, and the Viscount had witnessed exactly what Catherine would risk for someone with less power than she had. Lady Norwood turned as they approached, smile restored, eyes bright with calculation sharpened by anger. "Miss Larson," she said, "you have delayed enough. Attend me." Vale stopped beside Catherine, not touching her, close enough that every person watching understood proximity as position. "First," he said, "she will take some broth." Lady Norwood's smile froze at the edges. Then she said very softly, "You mistake interruption for victory, my lord." Catherine felt the room tilt toward whatever came next. Vale did not glance at Lady Norwood when she spoke. He looked at the nearest footman instead, a broad young man with a silver tray and the startled eyes of someone who had expected to pass unnoticed through the edge of a quarrel. "Broth," Vale said, "now, and bread. Fresh, not display." The footman bowed so fast the glasses on his tray chimed. "Yes, my lord," Lady Norwood's smile sharpened. "You presume extraordinary rights over my household?" He turned then, finally giving her full attention, and the room seemed to draw itself tighter around the three of them. "I presume nothing," he said. "I observe. Miss Larson is cold, underfed, and unsteady. If she falls in this room, under these chandeliers, before these witnesses. I would prefer not to step over another preventable cruelty tonight." The word cruelty passed through the nearest cluster of guests like a draught under a door. Fans paused. A gentleman coughed into his fist and forgot to lower it. Honoria's chin lifted by a fraction, but she did not speak. Catherine felt every eye turn to her face, then to her torn hem, then back again. Shame burned first, then anger, then the old instinct to make herself smaller so the scene would pass over her and settle elsewhere. She held still through all three. Lady Norwood gave a soft laugh that did not hide her teeth. "You misread discipline as cruelty because you do not manage girls. Thin appetites, dramatic nerves, and borrowed grievances do not impress me." Vale's gaze did not shift from her. "Nor does theft impress me." It was the first time he had said the word aloud in that room. Not scandal, not dispute, theft. Catherine felt her pulse strike hard at her throat. Mr. Halberd stepped in before Lady Norwood could answer, his tone oily with offended courtesy. "My lord, this has gone far enough. The young lady is party to a private arrangement. If she has been indulged beyond her station for one dance, very well. The evening may now proceed." "No," Vale said, "just that." No explanation, no rise in volume. The refusal landed with the weight of iron. Halberd's colour darkened. "You cannot simply deny a contract in negotiation." Vale looked at him as one might look at mud tracked across polished floors. "I can deny her isolation." "Start there." The footman returned at a near run with a plain white bowl of steaming broth, a small plate of bread, and a spoon he nearly dropped in his haste. Vale took the tray himself and set it on a side table between two candelabra where everyone could see it. Then he turned to Catherine. "Sit," he said. She remained standing. "I can stand." "You are swaying." "I am not." His eyes dropped once to her hands. They were shaking again, fine and constant, impossible to hide in this light. He lifted his gaze back to hers. "Sit." The command carried no softness. It carried certainty, and beneath certainty, a strange, unyielding respect for her survival that felt more dangerous than pity. Catherine lowered herself into the nearest chair because refusing him now would give Lady Norwood the scene she wanted, and because her knees had begun to lock from cold. The broth smelled of marrow and onions and salt. Heat rose against her face in visible steam. Her stomach clenched so sharply at the scent she had to steady the bowl with both hands before lifting it. Lady Norwood said, "Do not make a spectacle of this, Catherine." Catherine looked up. "I did not place the chair in the centre of your floor, ma'am." A murmur ran through the listeners. Honoria's fan snapped open. Halberd muttered something under his breath and received a warning glance from a matron who enjoyed scandal, but preferred it polished. Vale remained at Catherine's right shoulder, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. He did not touch her. He did not step away. Two gentlemen approached as if to reclaim the lane for dancing, saw his expression, and altered course at once. "Drink," he said quietly. She took one spoonful. It scalded her tongue and slid into the hollow under her ribs like fire entering a frozen room. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. She swallowed and took another. Across from them, Lady Norwood adjusted her bracelet with deliberate calm. "This cannot continue, Miss Larson. Put that down. You will attend Mr. Halberd." Catherine kept the spoon in motion. Her hand trembled less by the third swallow. Vale spoke, without looking away from Catherine. "No," Lady Norwood's voice thinned. "You forget yourself, Viscount. I remember every detail." He said it so flatly that Catherine looked up despite herself. His jaw had gone hard along the scar. The scar pulled faintly when he continued. "I remember seeing her outside these doors with sleet in her shoes, while your daughters warmed themselves by the fire. I remember your instruction that she wait by the service entrance. I remember hearing you deny her supper. I remember the shape of your fingers on her wrist." Silence dropped, complete and hard. The musicians at the far dais lowered their bows, uncertain whether to resume. Catherine stared at him. He had been there then, before the dance, before the corridor, before she had known he was in the building at all. He had seen what everyone else had trained themselves not to see. Lady Norwood recovered first, lifting her chin with brittle poise. "Eavesdropping in corridors is not evidence, my lord. You mistake overheard domestic correction for abuse because it flatters your heroic inclinations." "It does not flatter me," he said. "It indicts this room." His hand stayed on the chair, still, unmoving, as if he had anchored himself there and would not be displaced by rank mockery or precedent. By the time the long clock in the corridor struck 1:15, Catherine had finished half the bowl and one slice of bread, and no one had succeeded in moving Vale even one pace from her side. The strikes seemed to release the room from stunned suspension. Whispers started at the edges and moved inward in threads. "She was outside in this weather." "He said handprints." "Did you see her hem when she came in?" "Halberd, of all people!" Lady Norwood heard every word. Her fan moved faster. Rose water thickened in the air as she stepped closer to Catherine, close enough that the silver beading on her sleeve brushed the table. "Miss Larson," she said, with careful sweetness, "you have been indulged. Put the bowl down and come." Vale shifted one step, placing his body between Lady Norwood and the chair without touching either woman. The movement was small. Its meaning was not. "She remains seated," he said. Lady Norwood's composure cracked for one heartbeat. "You dare block me from my own relation?" "I dare prevent further contact in public." The line could not be mistaken. It was accusation and boundary in one sentence. Several guests inhaled sharply. Halberd took a half step backward, suddenly less certain of his footing. Catherine set the spoon down before her hand could spill it. Warmth had returned to her fingers in painful pins. Her stomach, no longer empty, had begun to hurt in a different way. She pressed one palm flat against the table edge and rose anyway. "I can stand now," she said. Vale looked at her. "Sit." "If I sit while you and Lady Norwood speak over me, I become furniture again." His gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he inclined his head once. "Very well, stand." She stood. He did not move away. Their sleeves nearly touched. Lady Norwood drew herself up to full height. "This has turned vulgar. I will end it. Mr. Halberd, fetch the carriage. Miss Larson is leaving." "No," Catherine said. Her voice was low, but it carried. A few heads turned further from the dance floor to listen openly now. Lady Norwood gave a brittle smile. "You do not choose." "I do." "On what authority?" Catherine felt the stitched packet against her left hip, like a second spine. "On my own." Halberd laughed once, short and disbelieving. "Your own authority does not satisfy creditors," Vale answered before Catherine could. "Then your creditors may present claims in daylight before a magistrate, not at midnight through coercion." Halberd's gaze flicked toward the far doors where the porter still waited. "You would drag this through court?" "If required," Lady Norwood said too quickly. "Required by whom?" Vale turned his head toward her. "By me." The words settled with finality. Whatever private negotiation had been intended for, Catherine had just been dragged into public process by a man who understood exactly what that meant for every person present. There would be records, witnesses, depositions, names. Lady Norwood's nostrils flared. "You have no standing in Larson family accounts." "No," Vale said. "I have standing an assault witnessed under this roof." Her fan froze. Catherine felt the world narrow to sound and light and breath. Assault, he had named that too. Not correction, not temper, not misfortune. Assault. She did not realise she had lifted a hand toward her mouth until Vale caught her wrist gently, just above the split thumb, stopping the movement before she touched the place Lady Norwood had struck. "Do not hide it," he said quietly, for her alone. His fingers released at once, but the heat of that brief contact remained, shocking in its restraint. He had touched her only to stop the old reflex of concealment. Nothing more, nothing less. Lady Norwood saw the gesture and smiled with venom. "How chivalrous!" "You collect wounded birds now, my lord?" "No," he said. "I collect facts." He looked to the steward nearest the wall, a narrow man with ink on his cuffs and fear in his posture. "You witnessed Lady Norwood strike Miss Larson earlier this evening?" The steward swallowed. His eyes darted to Lady Norwood, then to the gathered guests, then to Vale. There was an altercation near the side corridor, my lord." "Did you witness contact?" A pause that seemed to last the length of a winter. "Yes, my lord." Lady Norwood's laugh came out thin. "You are coercing staff testimony in my presence. Remarkable." Vale did not answer her. He addressed the steward again. "You will write what you witnessed before this hour ends. Sign and seal it. Deliver one copy to Mrs. Fenwick, one to the magistrate at the east carriage door." The steward went pale. "Magistrate, my lord." "Yes." Catherine felt Lady Norwood go rigid beside her, so the glimpse in the corridor had not been chance. He had arranged this. He had come with process already in motion. Lady Norwood recovered with visible effort. "You planned an ambush." "I planned for violence after I saw bruises," Vale said. "I was correct." For a breath, Catherine could not speak. No one had ever stated the logic so plainly. He had seen marks, predicted escalation, and positioned protection in advance. No pleading, no romance. Strategy as care. The musicians shifted uncertainly on the dais. A violin string gave a small accidental whine and was silenced. Vale looked down at Catherine's hands. "Can you hold the bowl?" "Yes." "Then finish it." Now! Lady Norwood made an exasperated sound. "This is absurd." Vale looked at her once. "So is starving a ward in public and calling it discipline." Catherine lifted the bowl again, because there was no room left for pride in an empty body, and because obeying this command felt unlike obedience to Lady Norwood. This was not erasure. This was insistence that she remain upright long enough to choose her next words clearly. She drank. The last of the broth had cooled. Fat had formed a thin film at the edge. She drank anyway and set the bowl down empty. Vale nodded once, as if a term in an unspoken contract had been met. "Good," he said. That single word reached somewhere deep and guarded inside her. Approval had always been rationed in her life as a tool of control. This did not feel like that. It felt like recognition of effort measured in survival, not performance. Halberd, perhaps sensing the tide turning, tried one final angle. "Miss Larson, if you permit this man to interfere, your reputation will be ash by morning. No decent household will receive you." Catherine turned toward him, fully. Warmth from the broth had steadied her voice. "No decent household has received me for a year," she said. "I was merely required to pretend otherwise." A few guests lowered their eyes. One matron did not. Halberd flushed. "Ungrateful girl!" Vale's head turned. "Do not address her again." Halberd opened his mouth, then shut it. Lady Norwood said, each word clipped to bloodless precision, "You cannot station yourself beside her forever." Vale's expression did not alter. "Watch me." He said it without flourish, without anger, as if stating a practical schedule, and then he did exactly that. He remained where he was, one pace from Catherine, while the room rearranged itself around the fact of his refusal to leave. A fresh set began and faltered because too many dancers were watching this corner. Stewards moved in nervous lines. The porter at the east door straightened when a uniformed official entered at last and paused for instructions. Catherine saw him only at the edge of vision. Her focus had narrowed to the man beside her who had made a public boundary so explicit it could not be withdrawn later without self-betrayal. She spoke without looking up. "Why me?" Vale answered after a brief silence, voice low enough that only she heard. "Because you protect down the line when no one is watching. Because you keep records when everyone else keeps silence. Because when ordered to sell yourself, you still stopped to save a servant's hand." He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between her and the advancing cluster of onlookers with practised economy. "And because if I step away now," he said, "they will close on you again." The confession was not tender, it was operational, it was also irrevocable. Catherine lifted her head and met his gaze. Grey eyes, no softness offered, no retreat available. "I will not run," she said. "I know." At the far edge of the floor, the magistrate removed his gloves and nodded once toward Vale, awaiting direction. Lady Norwood saw him and went very still. Honoria's face drained to candle-wax white. Vale did not take his eyes from Catherine when he spoke the next command, quiet and final. "Stay beside me." Catherine stood where he placed her, close enough to feel the heat of his sleeve through damp wool, and watched the magistrate cross the edge of the ballroom with 2 court officers at his back, and road salt still silvering the hems of their coats. Vale lifted one hand, not high, merely enough. "Clear the floor." The command moved faster than music. Stewards hurried, musicians lowered bows. Dancers stepped back in widening rings until polished boards lay bare between the chandeliers and the card tables, empty except for Catherine Vale, Lady Norwood, Mr. Halberd, and the men who had come to witness law replace arrangement. The room breathed in and held it. The magistrate bowed first to no one, then to everyone. "Edmund Pike, sitting magistrate for Westminster. I am informed there are allegations of coercion, assault, and financial fraud tied to the Larson estate." Lady Norwood laughed softly. "You are informed by a Viscount who enjoys spectacle." "I am informed by witnesses," Pike said, "and by documents, if they exist." Catherine felt the stitched seam at her left hip pull against her skin. Her fingers went to it by instinct. Vale saw the motion, gave one brief nod, and stepped half a pace aside so all eyes would remain on her, by her own choice, not his shelter. She reached beneath her overskirt, found the hidden basting, and broke it with the point of a hairpin she drew from her own dark knot. Thread snapped in small, dry sounds. Folded papers slid into her palm, warm from her body, edges softened by months of concealment. She held them out. "I copied these from daybooks, tenant ledgers, and transfer slips over the past year," she said. "Dates, amounts, receiving accounts. The original books are at Norwood House in the locked office cabinet, second shelf, back panel." A stir ran through the guests. Lady Norwood's face emptied of colour for one heartbeat, then refilled with fury. "She stole private papers." "I copied public theft," Catherine answered. Pike accepted the packet, then turned to his clerk. "Mark and seal as submitted by Miss Catherine Larson in the presence of this assembly." Wax warmed over a taper. Seal pressed, thread tied. The physical weight left Catherine's hand, and with it the constant fear of losing everything in a single search. Vale spoke to the steward with ink on his cuffs. "Your statement." The steward stepped forward with shaking fingers and produced a folded sheet, blot still fresh. "Signed by me, Thomas Reed, steward on duty. I witnessed Lady Norwood strike Miss Larson near the side corridor shortly after midnight." Pike took it. Copy delivered to Mrs. Fenwick as instructed. A woman in housekeeper's black spine straight as a ruler stepped from the side passage. "It was, sir. I countersigned time and receipt. The injured maid, Martha, has been rewrapped by my staff. Clean cut to the palm, no tendon involvement. She will keep use of the hand." Catherine let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Martha was safe. Tom's run and the bought broth had carried through to care, record, and witness. Pike looked to Halberd. "You carried a draft declaration regarding Miss Larson's marriage by dawn." Halberd's jaw worked. "A private understanding." "Produce it." Halberd hesitated. One officer stepped nearer. Halberd surrendered the paper. Pike unfolded it, scanned, and held it up toward the nearest candelabrum. "Unsigned. Settlement terms favouring creditor recovery through compulsory union. Names blank in body. Miss Larson entered in margin." He lowered it. "This is coercive intent." Lady Norwood snapped. "That document is nothing." Pike's gaze shifted to Halberd's cuff, where red wax had dried in a rough crescent. "Your seal?" Halberd pulled his hand back too late. Pike nodded to his clerk, who compared the wax mark to the impression on the declaration, and then to one of Catherine's copied transfer slips. The same crest, shallow at one edge where the signet had chipped. The strange smear Catherine had seen in the corridor became evidence in plain view. "Noted," said the clerk. Honoria Norwood took one step forward, opened her mouth, and closed it again. Her sister caught her sleeve and whispered urgently, but neither spoke. The looks they had traded all night dissolved into silence. They offered no defence, no confession, no rescue for their mother. Pike turned to Lady Norwood. "Pending full accounting at first light, I order immediate seizure of Larson estate books, suspension of discretionary control, and protective custody for Lady Norwood on charges of assault and suspected embezzlement. Mr. Halberd, you will remain available for examination." "You cannot remove me before these people," Lady Norwood said, voice breaking at the edges. "I am a lady." Pike answered without heat. "You are a subject of inquiry." When the officers took her wrists, she twisted toward Catherine, silk hissing, rose water sharp as vinegar now. "Ungrateful child, you will destroy your own name." Catherine met her gaze and did not lower hers. "You spent it already." Lady Norwood was led across the same floor where she had displayed Catherine as debt. Guests parted. No one reached to stop the officers. The side doors closed behind her with a heavy wooden report that settled through the room like a verdict. By the time the long clock struck 1, clerks were already dispatching runners to Norwood House with warrants and inventory forms. Vale remained beside Catherine while Pike's men took custody of the packet, the draft declaration, the steward's statement, and Mrs. Fenwick's countersigned note. Nothing vanished into rumour, everything entered record. When the last official seal cooled, Pike bowed to Catherine. "Miss Larson, you will attend my chambers at 9 to identify original books and attest copies. You have done difficult work correctly." "I will attend," she said. Vale spoke then, low and direct. "You will come in my carriage, no argument." She was too tired to resist and too clear-headed now to mistake the order for ownership. "Very well, my lord." At dawn, fog lay low over the square as they stepped into the magistrate's offices, where coal smoke and ink made the air dense and practical. Catherine identified each ledger, each altered line, each tenant receipt marked, paid, then rewritten, unpaid. Pike listened. Clerks tallied. By noon, the pattern no longer needed belief. It had Arithmetic. That same afternoon, in the drawing-room of the dower house that had once belonged to her father's sister and had sat shuttered for years, Catherine stood at a table with Mrs. Harper, the former Larson housekeeper, Martha with her hand neatly bandaged, Tom scrubbed and solemn in a borrowed waistcoat, and 6 other servants who had waited too long for wages, promised and deferred. Pike's order lay open before her, black script under official seal, restoration of her dowry control, interim authority over household expenditures, and release of frozen rents pending civil settlement. Catherine opened the strong-box recovered from Lady Norwood's desk and counted aloud. Her voice did not shake now. Back wages first, full quarter to each, plus the withheld month from Michaelmas. She looked up. No one will be turned out for asking what's owed. Martha wiped at her eyes with her uninjured hand. Tom stared at the coins as if they might disappear if he blinked. Mrs. Harper gave a single grave nod. Your father would have approved, Miss Catherine. I know, Catherine said. It was the first time in a year she had used that certainty without flinching. 3 weeks later, on a grey morning washed clean by rain in the night, she stood in a small private chapel with stone walls, 2 candles at the altar, Pike as legal witness, Mrs. Harper and Martha on one side and Vale on the other in a dark coat without ornament. No ballroom crowd, no auction of obedience, just words spoken in full hearing and entered in full record. When the vows were done and the register signed, Vale did not claim her hand at once. He waited. Catherine Larson, he said quietly, will you dance with me? There was no orchestra, only the faint echo of rainwater dripping from the eaves and the clerk closing the marriage book behind them. She placed her hand in his anyway. He drew her into a slow turn across worn flagstones, careful of her left foot, though the torn slipper was long gone, careful of her thumb, though the split had healed to a thin pale line. He moved with military precision and unexpected patience, as if relearning how to stand near warmth without retreat. His mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. When the turn ended, he kept her hand and spoke in the same clipped cadence he had used on the ballroom floor, but the command had changed shape. Stay beside me. I choose to, she answered.